The ship was drifting, not sinking, not damaged, just drifting. Alone in the Atlantic, the crew of the Degradia pulled alongside her and stared. The sails were half raised, her rigging tangled, the deck empty. They climbed aboard, and inside the cabin, plates sat on a table. A child's spoon lay beside them. A sewing kit rested where someone had left mid-stitch. The captain's log was open. The last entry, 10 days earlier. And after that, nothing. The ship still had enough food to last for months. The cargo was untouched. Money still in drawers. Somewhere out there, 10 souls had vanished into open water. And no one, not then, not now, knows exactly why. Welcome back to Legends May Live, where we explore the strange, the mysterious, and the eerie. I'm Drew. Before we get into today's episode, quick note. We do our best to stick to the facts, but some accounts conflict, details blur over times, and names may very well get mispronounced, so just take this as entertainment. On December 5th, 1872, roughly 400 miles east of Azores, the brigantine, Degradia, cut through gray water under overcast skies. Captain David Morehouse stood on deck, scanning the horizon. They had been at sea for weeks, and their supplies were running low. Every extra mile mattered. Then one of the crew shouted that there was a ship off the starboard. Through his glass, Morehouse saw it. It was a familiar silhouette, tattered sails and uneven course, just drifting. He felt a chill. He recognized the ship. It was the Mary Celeste. They had departed New York days apart, bound for the same region. But something was wrong. It wasn't signaling. It wasn't correcting course. There was no sign of life. A small team crossed over and then got on deck. It was slick. The rigging was tangled. Hatches were partly open. No one came to welcome them, and they listened, but there were no voices either. They called out, but everything was silent. Inside, they found life paused. There was a kettle on the stove, there were clothes folded, a child's spoon on the table, and the captain's log open. The money was untouched, the cargo was intact. The crew was baffled. They could see that there was no struggle and nothing taken, and the ship itself seemed fine, aside from some tangled ropes and the slick deck, but the lifeboat was gone. Captain Morehouse stood in the cabin, hands on his hips, trying to understand. Why abandon a seaworthy vessel? Why leave food? And why take the family? They leave without distress signals. No answer really fit. The mystery had begun. When the Mary Celeste was brought into Gibraltar, she became more than a mystery. It became evidence. Under maritime law, a ship found abandoned could be claimed or salvaged, but only after an investigation, and this one would be thorough. Officials immediately began to question the Degradia crew. Why had they been so close? Why had they boarded? And why had they taken control? Some quietly wondered, had they done something to the crew? Had this been piracy, all somehow without blood? Captain Morehouse was furious. He had known the Mary Celeste captain, Briggs, and he had sailed with him. They trusted one another, and the idea just insulted him. But still, inquiries continued. Crew members testified for weeks, and their every movement was examined and every log checked. Nothing incriminating surfaced, and the investigators couldn't find any real motive or evidence that the Degradia crew had done anything wrong. Investigators inspected every inch of the vessel too, and once again, they found no signs of theft or violence. What they did find was one cracked alcohol barrel, faulty chronometer, minor water in the bilge, displaced cargo, small problems that were by themselves harmless, but together a little unnerving. The final log entry became central. All well. How could everything be well hours before abandonment? Was Briggs lying, or maybe just reassuring himself? Experts debated, but they couldn't come to an agreement. After months, the court ruled that there was no crime, just an abandonment. But abandonment explained nothing. It was kind of just a word used when answers ran out. The law closed the case. History did not. Over the next century and a half, dozens of explanations would emerge. Some practical, some absurd, and some terrifying. Some proposed that a rogue wave, a seaquake, or waterspout convinced the sailors that the ship was doomed and forced them to abandon ship. Some suggested mutiny or piracy, but that doesn't fit anything investigators saw. But then there were supernatural theories that ghosts or sea monsters or curses were involved. But with all the available evidence and over a century to piece it all together, here is a reconstruction of what is most widely believed to have happened. In October of 1872, the Mary Celeste was a sturdy American ship built for long voyages and reliability. It was a ship fit for its captain, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs. Briggs was a deeply religious 37-year-old man. He was intelligent, strategic, and highly methodical. It was almost a privilege for any man to sail under him, is just sort of get to learn from his highly respected captain that it was just this great opportunity. In addition to knowing his trade better than most, he was also one to keep careful logs. He liked to document everything because it helped him with his detailed planning, which also made him the kind of captain that insurers loved. It was just much easier to deal with someone like this if anything did go wrong, but it was also highly unlikely that anyone with this kind of attention to detail and preparedness would have any sort of issues aside from what might be called acts of God. And Briggs also liked to write long letters, which was probably due to his high intelligence. He just felt like there's so much context needed for things that the reader has no way of extrapolating, so you need to include it. Like, this guy was just somebody who really did kind of think about everything and see things from every point of view he could. Though not every letter was a long one. Some were simple and straight to the point when there really wasn't anything to explain. One letter to his mother, he wrote, "Our vessel is splendid condition. I trust she will carry us safely to Genoa. Sarah and Sophia are well. God willing, we shall arrive before the winter sets in." On this particular voyage, Briggs had brought his family. Sarah was his wife. She was also a strong and intelligent woman, which was part of what drew Briggs to her. And Sarah had been on these trips across the ocean with him before. And with her was their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, and this would be her first trip. Now, most captains don't bring their wives and children along with them. The sea was unpredictable, and there were storms, accidents, and even disease to worry about, but Briggs was a competent and experienced man, and he believed this trip would be a smooth and routine one, with nothing to worry about. And if anything did go wrong, he could handle it. It wasn't really a big deal. And this was a working voyage, but it was also sort of a family trip, though his older son was behind in Massachusetts, enrolled in school, so he couldn't join them. As Briggs was getting ready for the voyage, he began assembling the crew, and eventually 7 crew members signed on. All of them were very experienced and vetted by Briggs himself. He made sure that none were criminals or troublemakers. He needed a crew that he could trust. And among them was Albert Richardson, the first mate, Andrew Gilling, second mate, and Edward Head, the steward. And they were men with families and values similar to his own. So after every box was checked and everything was logged and planned out, Briggs stood smiling for a few minutes on the dock with one arm wrapped around Sarah and the other holding Sophia, before he and his family boarded the ship. On November 7th, 1872, the Mary Celeste slipped out of New York Harbor, headed for Genoa, Italy. The hold was filled with 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, a very valuable cargo. The hull was strong, the crew was ready, and the weather was fair. As the coastline faded behind them, Briggs stood at the rail with Sarah and Sophia, watching America disappear into the fog. For the first few days, everything went exactly as planned. The Atlantic was kind to them, and the waters were smooth. There were no violent storms, no heavy fog, or any issues with the ship itself, so Briggs and the crew had it pretty easy. It was just long open waters and steady wind. It was really just the kind of crossing sailors prayed for. Each morning, Briggs rose before sunrise, checked the compass, inspected the rigging, and reviewed the log. Course steady, speed consistent, crew healthy, no complaints. Below deck, Sarah kept the small cabin neat. Sophia walked around playing, laughing, and hanging on things, trying to climb up on furniture. The crewmen sometimes stopped by just to make her laugh. For a few minutes each day, the ship felt less like a workplace and more like a floating home. They all shared meals together, swapped stories, and prayed at night. Briggs held short services on Sundays, and hymns carried across the deck as the sun sank into the sea. On November 15th, there was the first small issue. The chronometer, the ship's most important timekeeping device, began losing minutes. And without it, longitude calculations drift. And at this point, it's not really dangerous, but it requires constant correction. So Briggs made a quick note in the log. Chronometer unreliable, will compensate. Then a few days later, there's another problem. Several crewmen notice a faint odor rising from the hold. It's a sharp chemical smell, almost sweet. It's the industrial alcohol leaking. Not enough to even see, but that had to be what was happening. Briggs inspected the barrels, and they all seemed to be intact. Stoppers were tight, there were no stains or puddles, so since there was no immediate concern, he logged it and moved on with the plan to keep going and check on it from time to time. As November turned into December, the weather shifted. Nothing too crazy, just sort of strange. There were patches of fog that arrived without warning, and winds abruptly changed direction midday, and the sails would just snap at odd angles, and the sea stopped feeling predictable. Some crew members began sleeping lightly and waking at small sounds. The stress of feeling like they weren't in control really kind of started to get to them. One sailor wakes up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, and he had dreamed that the waves got so high that they were climbing the mast. Another swore he heard footsteps on deck when no one was there. And Briggs noticed the strange weather, and he could tell that the crew was on edge, but he didn't react to it. He just stayed disciplined, stuck to the route, and maintained order best he could. And so, the Mary Celeste sailed on. By the final week of November, the Atlantic changed mood again. The waters were getting rougher, and by now the winds were really getting unpredictable and changing direction without warning. Waves began to strike the hull at awkward angles, and still this wasn't too much, nothing extreme or dramatic, but it was enough to keep everyone on their toes. Captain Briggs increased watch rotations. The shorter days and easier shifts were gone. Men stayed on the deck longer, scanning the horizon and keeping ropes and rails within reach. Also, the smell from the cargo hold returned. It was stronger now. The fumes from the industrial alcohol were even burning the men's noses as they got too close. And the alcohol was flammable and dangerous in enclosed spaces, so Briggs ordered inspections twice daily. The crew tapped the barrels, checked seals, and ventilated whenever weather allowed, but they couldn't find the leak, and still the smell lingered. One sailor muttered quietly that it felt like they were sitting on a power keg. On November 27th, Briggs noted water in the bilge. It wasn't flooding, but more than usual. He had the pumps run and the water receded, but it returned just days later. He ran it again, but once again, it returned. It was a rhythm he did not like. He inspected the hull personally, and there was no breach or crack or any sign of where the water could possibly be coming from. And Briggs wrote another short letter. The winds have been erratic, the chronometer unreliable, cargo fumes troublesome, still I believe we remain safe. As the days passed, patience thinned, and sleep grew shallow. Tempers worsened and small disagreements lingered. The crew was strained. First mate Richardson urged caution. Second mate Gilling argued for speed. Briggs stood between them, measured and controlled, but tired. By December 2nd, the smell from the hold was impossible to ignore. It drifted up through the planks, clung to clothes, and settled in the back of the throat. Alcohol vapor hung like a cloud around the ship. and they were a spark away from disaster. Sometime after midnight, there's a sudden breath from the deep inside of the ship. Every man on deck froze. Richardson grabbed the rail and whispered, "Did you hear that?" But Briggs didn't say a word. He was already moving. They opened the hold, and the hot chemical air rushed upward, burning their eyes and making their throats tighten. Several barrels had shifted. One was cracked at the seam. It wasn't visibly leaking, but it was releasing vapor. Briggs ordered immediate ventilation. They rolled back the canvas and propped open the hatches. Men rotated in short shifts. No one stayed below deck long. That afternoon, Richardson confronted Briggs, saying that if the vapor ignites, they shouldn't be on top of it when it does. Briggs thought for a minute before looking at him and questioning if he was really suggesting abandoning a seaworthy vessel. Richardson said yes, but just for a while, just until the ship airs out. They stood in silence. Between them, there was a ship, a family, and 10 lives. Briggs checked their position. They were near the Azores, within reach of land if they really needed it. The lifeboat was ready, supplies stocked and the rope attached. He walked to the cabin, looked in to see Sophia asleep. Sarah was reading. She looked up, and with just a few words from Briggs, she got up and began to get ready, without asking a single question. She trusted Briggs wholeheartedly. As dusk fell, the vapor thickened again and the wind dropped. The air grew heavy and static danced on metal fittings. A dangerous combination. Briggs gathered the officers. He spoke calmly and clearly. He told them, "We will secure the ship. We'll take the boat. We will drift nearby. When the air clears, we return." And with that, the crew was ready. It was a sensible precaution. The morning of December 4th, 1872 came without drama. There were no storms or fires, just gray light spilling over quiet water. The Mary Celeste drifted steadily with sails half raised and rudder secured. Briggs ordered the ship stabilized. The crew tightened the ropes, trimmed the sails, and secured the cargo. They were leaving nothing to chance. Shortly after sunrise, Briggs opened the log and noted their position. 38 degrees, 20 minutes north, 7 degrees, 15 minutes west. He noted that the weather was fair and closed by noting all was well. The lifeboat was lowered carefully and food was loaded onto it. Water barrels were secured and navigation tools were placed. A coil of rope remained tied to the Mary Celeste that was long enough to tow and return on. Sarah packed a small bag with some extra clothes, a book, and Sophia's blanket. One by one, the crew climbed down, 7 men, each carrying something small, a coat, a journal, a keepsake, nothing heavy or anything important, since they would be returning once they knew that all was safe. The lifeboat with 10 people slid into the Atlantic without a sound, all of them watching the Mary Celeste from below. The ship towered over them. They drifted just far enough from the ship to escape the fumes, and now with the clean air, they could clear their heads a bit and breathe easier, both literally and figuratively, since they were no longer sitting on a ship filled with highly flammable alcohol. The crew began to pass the time talking and laughing. Sarah began reading her book, and Sophia slept. Minutes turned into hours, and the vapor thinned. The ship was starting to look safe again, but then the winds shifted. Barely noticeable, but enough to make a difference. The Mary Celeste began to drift away, slowly, but with a constant pull. Briggs was the first to notice. He stood up in the life raft and shielded his eyes as he focused on the ship. Groaning to the crew, "We're moving," and soon the rope tightened and began to pull the lifeboat. The crew began rowing with steady, measured strokes to close the gap, but just when they got close, the wind picked up again and once again strained the rope and put the crew in a race with the Mary Celeste, until finally the rope snapped. For a moment, no one moved. They kind of just looked at each other with disbelief as the ship kept drifting. It became just a small white shape on the blue water, growing smaller and smaller. The crew shouted as oars splashed wildly, but there was no catching up. The wind and sea were too much to overcome, and the ship was moving too fast. Sarah clutched Sophia. Richardson stared in disbelief, and Briggs said nothing. He just watched. In less than 5 minutes, the Mary Celeste was gone, just out of reach. No one knows what happened after the rope broke. There were no logs, messages, or survivors, at least not that we know of. But we can make reasonable guesses, and every one of them is terrible. The lifeboat was small, barely meant for short transfers, not for drifting, certainly not room enough for 10 people to live on for weeks. And it was also not meant to hold up against storms. It had food for days, water for maybe a week, but there was no shade from the sun or weather. They also had no flares or any other way to be seen. Records show that weather worsened within 24 hours. The seas got rough with towering waves and the nights were frigid. If they tried to row toward land, they were fighting current. If they waited, they were at the mercy of the wind. Either way, chances of survival were slipping. Sarah would have wrapped Sophia in blankets, held her close, and tried to shield her from the spray, from cold, and from fear. Briggs would have likely stayed alert, counting the hours and scanning the horizon. He wasn't the type to just lay down and die. He had promised his mother he would bring them home. At some point, exhaustion would win out over the crew. Oars would drop as hope thinned. Maybe a storm overturned them. Maybe dehydration took hold. Maybe they drifted for weeks, or it's even possible that they did make landfall on some remote island. The truth is, no one really knows. But no bodies or wreckage were ever found. But finding anything would be nearly impossible with just the vast size of the ocean. And so, 10 people aboard the Mary Celeste were erased by a decision meant to save them. After the Mary Celeste had been found drifting and after the investigation, the ship was repaired, though it didn't really need much. And then it was renamed and returned to service. But misfortune followed her. From bad cargo to financial loss to accidents, the ship just seemed to attract trouble. In 1885, the final captain deliberately ran her into a reef in Haiti in an insurance scam. The ship broke apart and disappeared beneath the waves. Even in death, she couldn't escape her legacy of tragedy. Somewhere in the Atlantic, currents still move over the place where they vanished, and sometimes when sailors pass through that region at night, they report something strange. A ship-shaped shadow, a sound like footsteps on empty decks, and a bell that isn't there. It's probably imagination, but every time the ocean goes quiet, every time a ship drifts without explanation, we remember. The Mary Celeste didn't sink, burn, or explode. She simply lost her people and sailed on without them. That's it for today's episode of Legends May Live. If you enjoyed the story, please remember to like, follow, and share it with a friend who likes the strange and mysterious. Until next time, keep watch, and if you see a tattered ship drifting on the sea, remember, legends may live.